So I have been making collages and poetry, cut-up poetry specifically, since about 2019 in a very serious way. The reason for doing that is because there is such a wealth of material, visual material in our daily lives, and because I was studying, or researching rather, visual storytelling for the past 6 years, I could suddenly see all kinds of mythologies and fragments of mythologies in everyday advertisements. For example, for cleaning products, I would see Cinderella, and in certain articles I would definitely detect Medea, and I started very much focusing on fragmented narratives and the roles that women are casting, them historically and today. The titles are really reference points for the gallery visitors and viewers to the originary either myths, stories, folk tales, oral histories that exist in order to situate and position them within a particular story, because the collages and the poetry focus on particular moments from different stories, and sometimes the link is very obvious, and other times it is a bit more discreet and subtle. So I hope that those titles at least give a kind of way in to the work. The title Mythopoeia came to me after some time because I realized what I was doing is the definition of the word, which is inventing mythologies. And it's a very modern word. I believe it's Tolkien who coined it, and it's starkly different from how we think about myths historically, which are typically thought to be to have originated from anonymous authors and collective authors, whereas in our kind of modern, now postmodern times, since Tolkien and forward, there was a kind of sharp contrast between how we understand mythologies. And I think Roland Barthes is a really good example of taking up the term mythologies and applying it to everyday stories that we encounter in visual and textual form. So I felt it was appropriate. During the course of my research, I started to get very much interested in the roles that women, fictional and factual, were casting in the collective stories that have come down to us throughout the centuries. I really wanted to sort of focus on the inner world as a mythic space of these characters, whether they're real or not. So, by which I mean, the title Mythopoeia is, on the one hand, quite sincere, and on the other hand, it's also a little bit, if not playful, definitely ironic, in the sense that in our inner worlds, things seem like myths when they happen to us. But in the external world, what's considered mythic is of epic proportions, such as tragedy, those sorts of epic proportions. So I really wanted to focus on more intimate realities that nevertheless affect our daily lives. I hope that's not too obscure of a way to phrase it, but I started to imagine whether these characters had an inner world and how important that was if we were to consider them from today's perspective, when we're so interested in the inner lives of people. Sandra wrote about collage and the cut-up method of composing poetry being a female art form is a valid point of view, because we learn about male authors such as Tristan Tzara and William S. Burroughs and Brian Gyson and others before and after who have used those methods. And we rarely really focus on the women. But in terms of my own practice, what I can say is that it's to do with the intimacy of the scale of the work, and this idea that intense labor is concentrated in a very small space is something that I think has historically been true for women in terms of sewing and embroidery and all kinds of other very specific little tasks. In addition to that, I would say that once you move the whole paradigm to something more intimate, I think let's say the female perspective is able to somehow absorb that and project it back out as something more significant. What is on show at Spot Gallery is a selection of the collages that I've made over the last several years, more tailored to this theme of a sea of myths. So that is, the majority are here, so it's quite a dense, detailed exhibition of the work, but they are also, all of these actually feature also in the book, in the Poets, where they are paired with the poems in a kind of dialogue. So I hope to introduce the visitors both to the visual work and also to the poetry and to the narrative structures that I've tried to introduce with this whole cycle of works. So Meet the Poets was published last year, so 2023 in February. It was a wonderful experience to work with Ross Fry Publishing, who very much, at least in the Slovenian scene, work with artists and in a way that they allow artists to also contribute their vision and ideas to the book itself. So I had a considerable amount of freedom in terms of editing, and they were very supportive. So I'm very glad that we had this experience together, and it is my first book of both poetry and art. So I'm delighted, and I'm really glad to exhibit a portion of it here as well. So despite the very evocative title that promises so much with the Poets, these collages are very, I would say, humble in terms of their materiality. They're on cardboard, they're very portable, small but intense pieces of work. And the reason I decided to display them in this sort of non-glass case way is just for the viewers to be able to really take a close look at them like they would any printed publication or an artwork that is designed to be intimate and address the viewer more directly, and hence the velvety pink support as well, just to help that experience of a little bit of warmth and a bit more everydayness than some very exceptional piece of precious art. They're precious in a different way, I think, I hope.
Opium Clippers project started in 2012, I think, or 14, not sure, in Baltimore when I did a residency there at UMBC. And actually I did the residency there not for this project. I was there to research other things, public space most of all, and the use of it. But while I was there, I also experienced what was later declared as an opioid addiction epidemic. While I was there, I started thinking about how the economy behind an opioid addiction epidemic works. Because it's obvious that large amounts of illegal economies is involved. When I was in Baltimore, I started going through the archives and founded the first opium clipper, which were ships that were specially built to transport opium in the 19th century. It was designed in Baltimore. And from there on, I started researching the tea and opium relationship, which is a very intertwined relationship between the legal economy of tea trade and the illegal economy of opium trade. From that, 5 years later, started the Opium Clippers project, which was a tea ceremony that I also performed here 5 years ago, I think, in this Galerija Spot. The Opium Clippers project was actually a tea ceremony with hand-painted ceramics and storytelling. But while I was researching the narrative of that project, I came to discover that many things that I talk about from 19th century still exist today, or at least in some sort of traces, or can be connected to that illegal economy. And I started collecting those things, and some of them then ended up in the Opium Clippers artist book, which is today exhibited in the gallery. What was fascinating for me were at first the stories. So many buildings, rituals, objects can be connected, that we know of today, can be connected to the illegal opium trade of the 19th century, and one could walk around and not even know that this is what the things actually come from. But then I thought, if I want to collect all the images, I have to travel the whole world. And I started looking up images that exist online, and I found out actually that for every story that I have, there is an image that someone posted, and I thought it is actually it kind of underlines the fact that these are everyday images. So I found them in the Creative Commons databases, but they were not connected anyhow to opium trade, or they were just images of places, buildings, and things that people found interesting and made photos of. And for some of them there was a choice, there was a certain amount of images available. For others there was just one photo that was available, so in some cases I didn't have much choice, but still for where I had choice, I tried to select those that seemed most photographically aesthetic, regular, and impressive by themselves. I'm showing a selection of pages from the artist book, and from the beginning my idea of this artist book that it will not be like a regular book. The book itself the pages are not bound, so once the one who uses the book or wants to read it, they will immediately mix up the order of the pages. And because the whole project is a lot about different information, the readers are invited to make their own connections between the protagonists that repeat themselves throughout the book in very different contexts. My idea was that the book itself is a sort of like a folder of prints that people can take out and maybe put in their own frames. So from the very beginning I imagined this book also framed and as an independent work of art that might be or might not be a background of the tea ceremonies, but these two works definitely speak to each other, because if you come to the tea ceremony, you learn everything that led to these traces that you see in the exhibition. So I'm showing a selection of these prints. We actually met through Opium Clippers, right?
Yes, that's right.
And ever since, well, that's my version of our beginning of collaborations, but ever since we met, we found that we have some creative approach that is common to both of us.
Yes, for a long time I was interested in Neja's work because of her storytelling practice, and and aesthetically and otherwise, and we often talk about artworks and seem to have a lot in common, at least in our approach, as Neja said, if not in the final outcome. I think there's a certain maybe subtlety or gentleness from my perspective that we have in common that comes from the approach, but also I think is somewhere in the work in the end, the same kind of attention to detail perhaps. And
also I would say that the element of storytelling is very prominent, but also of collaging, because in the end you actually produce your final outcome are the collages, but they are also connected to poetry. This approach is also, I think, something that is very that we have in common, that it's not only the work that you see in front of you, it's also a storytelling performance, it is also a poetry book, and it has so many more elements, how it comes together and how it comes to life, and it is also both works can be activated through a performative piece. And even though Anna's, I think, in terms of content, she speaks about myths and it's poetry, my work is much more factual, but I think that the dialogue that comes to the front is actually the question of fiction and of narrative, because if my works stand on their own, they might be perceived as solely documentary or as if they're narrating the truth, or some sort of historical, actual, factual historical narrative. But being in dialogue with Anna's work, they have a different, I think it offers a different reading that gives them a more like storytelling perspective and maybe makes them even more poetic.
Well, I think stories survive and storytelling survives because it's constantly relevant on some level. So repeated themes which tend to be universal, desire for whatever, wealth, expansion, more intimate forms of desire, love, loss, tragedy, betrayals. All of these elements, I think, are in both of our works, but from, I guess, very different points of view and slightly different perspectives. So in that sense, to tell a good story, all those elements need to be in there somehow. And we both chose an image and text approach to it, because for me at least, I think some things are impossible to communicate in text alone, and it's the same for images, but maybe it's because I'm certainly dealing, and I think Neya is as well, with both forms of narrative, visual and textual, so they're sort of not separable in a way.